So I had a chance to meet up with a friend the other day I hadn't seen in quite some time, and he moved out of state, um, had a baby with his girlfriend, and was coming back into the LA area and circling through the desert, and we had a chance to kind of connect and spend a little time together, which was really wonderful. And at one point, when we were getting ready to leave, I was getting ready to head back, and he was heading off. His girlfriend said, "Talk to Mitch about getting married." And I go, "What does that mean?" He goes, "Well, she wants to get married." I said, "Well, what's the problem with that?" And he was like, "Well, you know me, like my past and this." And then he started like laundry listing in a real like low energy, monotone, really poor case building about his childhood and his parents and their divorce and subsequent relationships and everything. And I go, "Man, that story is really tired." He's like, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, you're see," I said, it wasn't very convincing." I said, "I think you've been telling that story so many times and for so long that you just might be tired of it, because you know in your heart of hearts that there's no substance to it anymore. It once held water. There was weight to it. There was an opportunity to examine it and build a case around it, and you probably were incredibly convincing to a lot of people, including yourself. But I'll tell you, if you were trying to plead your case to me, that's not going to work." But the most important thing I said that I think you really need to consider and think about it is that your story has grown tired to you. It doesn't have the impact that it probably once had. Like if you were attempting to convince me, you clearly weren't. It wasn't working, and you, quite honestly, weren't convincing yourself either. He goes, "Yeah, I guess you're right." And it just, it just led me to be thinking, and it was so funny because I that night went to bed and I woke up like 3:30 in the morning, and I said, sometimes my inside game wakes me up, and I just started thinking about that conversation. I started thinking about the direction that went in, and I started thinking about how stories just get tired, and they just get old, and they've run their course, and they've run their usefulness. They're no longer effective. And the beauty that's there, like the inherent beauty in there, that not only was the story beautiful, because man, we can craft. We're so great at crafting the most perfect story to frame whatever we want to frame, to avoid whatever we want to avoid, to promote whatever we want to promote. We can craft a story. But man, what a beautiful moment to see a story crumble like that. To see a story just lose its luster, to just no longer have its effectiveness, to have worn out its welcome. Its purpose is now done. Now, if I would have gone along with what he was saying, we probably would have been in the same place. He probably would have still continued it. But I just couldn't. I could not point out that the way he was telling that story was so exhausting. Meaning, it was just done. It was exhausted. It was over. And the beauty of sharing that with him was it was able to reflect back to him that perhaps I was right about that. That he was right about it, that it's just no longer there. See, stories are a beautiful, beautiful thing. We develop these stories. I talk about this time and time again. We develop these stories in our lives because we need to make sense of the world around us. And we take on other people's stories. We adapt other people's stories. We create our own stories. There's just, if we didn't do it, we probably wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Because we would have to know that the world somehow, at least what we created to function on any level, that the world somehow had to be safe enough for us to do that. So we had to craft a story that would be able to create that level of safety. But here's the thing about stories. It's so interesting and dynamic into itself, is that stories, either, how do I say this? Either they protect us from things, they promote us towards other things, and they prevent us from even other things as well. So they protect us from the uncertainties of the world, from the potential dangers of the world. We craft them, we create them, we develop some things that are logic based, that are science based, that make sense, that assure us that we're okay to venture outside. And then there's other things that we're using a story to promote a way of being or a way of thinking or a way of doing, a way of being in the world. And other times we create these stories that, quite frankly, prevent us from getting to the next level. The truth of the matter is that once a story is done, it's done. Now, if my friend was telling the story about, well, my childhood this and my parents and their divorce and all the things that happened, blah blah, at some point that had some kind of a weight to it, and maybe perhaps, without judging a story as either good or bad, the story itself, whether it's true or not, doesn't even matter. But perhaps it was in that moment, maybe preventing him from something, but maybe protecting him because maybe he wasn't ready just yet to venture into the notion of marriage, the concept, the experience of it, that he just wasn't ready for it. So that story had weight to it. It was probably keeping him and keeping him safe from situations and circumstances where the person he potentially would have considered it with, or maybe was considering with him, would have said, no, this is not a good idea. This isn't going to work. This isn't going to make sense. This isn't the right scenario for me. And naturally and intuitively presented itself in such a way that they were able to get out of the situation and circumstance. But at a certain point, when the stars align, when situations and circumstances align, where all of a sudden you're in this relationship that is loving and that is nurturing, where you're able to be vulnerable and you're able to show who you are and the experience of all of that, and the person doesn't want to leave, they want to stay, and they want to invest more time and energy into their own growth and to watching you go into growing and to growing together. Now we're in a dynamic where all of a sudden the weight of that particular story doesn't have anything to it. There's no substance to it. Because this is finally the relationship where that story no longer makes sense. That story is no longer true. That the meaning that we assigned to that story had its value in a time and place that is no longer now. And as a result of that, able to then move forward, able to then be able to look at it and go, you know what? That story doesn't work for me. So that woke me up in the middle of the night. And I started to think about, well, like, what are the stories that I still hold on to? What are the stories that I still run? Sometimes I'll run a story, I don't even realize I'm running it, and I'll catch myself halfway through the story, and I'll just stop myself. I go, oh, sorry, excuse me, pardon me, that was a story. And the person looks at me like, what? I go, yeah, just living a genuine, more authentic life. I'm realizing that story is it's just old, and it just popped up, and it just instinctively went for it, but it just doesn't fit anymore. That's not really who I am. That's a reflection of where I once was, or who I once was, or pretending to be, but it's not who I am now, and it's not where I'm going. So I need to stop that. And they're like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. That you're able to catch yourself. That's never happened to me before. I go, well, I'll always keep you on your toes because I have to keep myself on my toes. I have to look at those stories. But I kept thinking, like, well, waking up in the middle of the night like that, like, how powerful that experience was. That stories, if we stop judging stories as good or bad, as right or wrong, but simply they are. And the truth of the matter is, in most situations, we don't have to prove them in a court of law. We don't have to prove them beyond a shadow of a doubt. Once we decide something is true, whether someone else agrees with it or not, it's true for us. It's our experience. It's our investment. And when it no longer fits, then it no longer fits. When it's used up its time and its energy and its purpose, and it no longer works, then we move on. Then we have a chance to craft a new story that is no longer about a reflection about where I once was, or what I once did, or how I once behaved, or how people once knew me, and how I once experienced myself, but it's who I am now and where I am going. So in that moment, lying there, started thinking about the stories that perhaps I still tell, that I still hold on to. So part of my inside game is to pay attention throughout the day of where I'm telling a story, or where I'm telling something that is just so familiar to me that I don't even realize it's a story. But I realize that if I hold on to that particular frequency and that particular energy of that thought, and with that thought is going to come a line of energy and emotion to it, that the greater likelihood is that I'll always just keep thinking the way I used to think and feeling the way I used to feel in the present moment, when it's no longer really what I'm about and where I am and where I'm going. So many situations during the course of a day that if you can just catch yourself, find yourself in a moment where you're realizing, oh, wow, I'm telling a story. Oh, wow, I'm falling into a pattern of behavior. I'm allowing my environment to dictate who I am in this moment when it's not really me. It's no longer me. And if I'm willing to catch myself and own that I'm in a story, I'm willing to catch myself and own that what I'm doing doesn't fit anymore. It's like trying something on that just doesn't really fit anymore, and you're trying to convince yourself, but the words that are coming out of your mouth and the thoughts that are in your head and the energy that is attached to it, just like that day, sitting there listening to him, I mean, it was just like it was monotone. It was like he was just reading off of a teleprompter or something, or this long list that he's carried around with him, with it within himself for years and years and years, but it just didn't have the energy to it. So no longer was he able to convince other people, let alone himself. Now, like I said, somebody else might have said, well, hold on a second, that makes complete sense. I mean, I can understand how you could feel that way. And I just couldn't allow this to go without noticing it and bringing it to his attention. I didn't feel comfortable as a friend, as a mentor, as a brother. I did not feel right to simply just sit there and just, oh, okay. No, if that's the way you feel, that's the way you think. I just couldn't do it. Because the truth be told, he was talking to me in a way because he wanted to hear my perspective on it. And I didn't necessarily have a perspective. Sometimes people, in marriage situations, a lot of times people at a certain age, when they have kids, they've raised kids, and they're with somebody else, they don't find a need for the actual commitment of marriage. They've made the commitment to themselves and to each other to be together, and that's enough. And in other situations, when couples are perhaps younger and they're planning a family or having a family and they want to have that foundation, that's wonderful too. There's no right or wrong here. But in the explaining of that and sharing of that, I wasn't there to judge the choice that he makes one way or another. I'm not invested in whether or not he ultimately decides to get married because he realizes that story no longer holds up. Maybe he decides still not to get married. That's his choice. That's the choice that they get to make together. But it's understanding when a story has worn out its welcome, when it's worn out its effectiveness, when it no longer carries the weight it once carried. And not only can we not convince other people of it, but we realize that we can no longer convince ourselves of that truth. Because the reality is, and this is what I said to him point blank, is I said, you're not who you are today is not who you were 2 years ago. Hopefully not 10 minutes ago necessarily. 5 years ago, 10 years ago. This is a story that you've been telling for probably 20 years around all this, and maybe thinking about it for even longer. But it's not who you are now. So I can look at you and say, that doesn't, it's like looking at something and somebody's wearing, it doesn't fit you properly. That doesn't come across as you. And how great it can be in the process of working our own inside game is when we're able to self-identify within ourselves that, what, this doesn't fit anymore. This is not who I am. This is not what I'm about. This is not what works for me anymore. And to be able to just allow the story. It's like this, we get to rewrite a new ending. We get to create a new story as a result of that. And if we want to use that story as a teaching moment for other people, fantastic. Yeah, I used to tell this story about X, Y, and Z about my childhood, and then at a certain point I realized it's over. It's done. It doesn't have the weight anymore. I realized that I was using that story as a way to keep me apart and separate from people. It allowed me to define my separateness. It allowed me to define, uh, for me, why I couldn't be a part of something. But now I love myself more, care about myself more. I want to be a part of something. And now when I go to tell that story, it just comes out flat. So I don't judge it. I forgive myself for any judgments that I may have about the telling of that story. Or for some people, it's like, I can't believe I told that story for so long. Well, perhaps you needed to tell that story for as long as you did. Perhaps the situations and circumstances weren't necessarily. Perhaps that story saved you. That story protected you. Because sometimes it does. It protects you. Sometimes it propels you to do things and go places you've never been before. And sometimes it does prevent you from living a bigger, better life. And perhaps without judgment, you weren't quite there yet to live that bigger, better life. So it worked. And it was okay. And it's still okay. Because now not only do you have the awareness that that story doesn't fit anymore, that you're ready to write a new story. That you're ready to create a new framework moving forward. A new opportunity for you to step into who you are and where you're going. And to fall in line with the gratitude that comes from that not only that deeper awareness, but that wisdom that you now carry with you as a result of all of the experiences. That you're no longer willing to forego the wisdom because the judgment is so profound of, I can't believe I did this. I can't believe I... No. You did it as long as you did it. As long as you needed to do it until you were ready to get what you needed to get. And then once you got it, you're ready to let it go. When it no longer served you, you're ready to let it go and move forward. That's the beauty of the story, provided we are unwilling in any point in time to judge any of it as a good story or a bad story, but the story that was present, the story that was present, and get to ask ourselves, what is the new story that's present for me now? I'm Mitch Newman. We'll see you again next time.